Hello, welcome back to the World War Lab channel, a place where we uncover forgotten moments of war that history almost buried. What you're about to hear is a true combat story from the final days of World War II, told exactly as it unfolded. At 4:47 in the early morning hours of May 11, 1945, Private John McKinney lay asleep inside his canvas tent near Dingalan Bay on the eastern coast of Luzon. He had no idea that roughly 100 Japanese soldiers were silently threading their way through the jungle toward his position. McKinney was 24 years old. He had spent 2.5 years in the army. He was the son of a Georgia sharecropper, raised in deep rural poverty, with only a third-grade education to his name. By May of 1945, the Philippine campaign had already cost the United States more than 60,000 casualties. Japanese forces on Luzon refused to surrender. Instead, they fought on with night infiltrations, dawn raids, and suicidal frontal assaults against American defensive lines. Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment, part of the 33rd Infantry Division, had established a small outpost near Dingalan Bay in what was then Tayabas Province. The position guarded a critical supply route along the coast. 3 American soldiers manned a light machine gun on the outer perimeter. McKinney had just finished a long, exhausting shift at that weapon. He walked a short distance to his tent, lay down on the ground, and placed his M1 rifle beside him before closing his eyes. The jungle around the camp was silent. The Japanese knew the outpost was there. They had been observing it for days, counting the Americans, timing the guard rotations, memorizing patterns, waiting for the right moment. Now that moment had come. More than 100 soldiers, remnants of shattered Japanese units still fighting on Luzon, moved through the darkness. They carried rifles, grenades, knee mortars, and swords. Their objective was brutally simple: overrun the American position, kill everyone, and seize the supplies. The lead element slipped past the outer guard post without being detected. A non-commissioned officer, Sergeant Fugaro Moriya, led the advance group. His orders were clear. The first Americans were to be eliminated silently, no gunfire, only blades. By the time the main force struck, the perimeter would already be broken. Moriya reached McKinney's tent. He could hear the slow rhythm of breathing inside. One quick strike would end the man's life before he could cry out. McKinney had grown up hunting in the woods of rural Georgia. His father farmed rented land in Scranton County. The family owned nothing. John learned to shoot long before he learned to read. By the age of 12, he could hit a squirrel at 50 yards with a .22 rifle. He trapped rabbits, shot deer, and fished local streams. When crops failed, hunting was often the only thing that kept food on the table. He enlisted at Fort McPherson in November of 1942. Army instructors quickly discovered that he could barely read or write. They also discovered something else. He was one of the most naturally gifted marksmen they had ever seen. His qualification scores were exceptional. Drill sergeants noticed that he moved through wooded terrain differently than other soldiers. Quieter, more alert, more aware of his surroundings. He had grown up in an environment where a single mistake could mean starvation. The 33rd Infantry Division deployed to the Pacific in 1943. McKinney fought through New Guinea. He survived the jungle. He survived combat against the Japanese. He survived malaria, dysentery, and everything else the Pacific Theater inflicted on American infantrymen. By May of 1945, he was a veteran, quiet, reserved, dependable, and never one to complain. Among his fellow soldiers, 2 things were universally known about John McKinney. He was the best shot in the company, and he slept with his rifle. That habit was about to save his life. If you want to see how McKinney survived what happened next, make sure to hit that like button. It helps us keep these forgotten stories alive. And if you're not already subscribed, consider joining us. Now, back to McKinney. At approximately 4:51 a.m., Sergeant Moriya yanked open the tent flap. His sword came down in a diagonal slash aimed at McKinney's neck. In the darkness, Moriya misjudged the distance. The blade struck the side of McKinney's head instead, slicing away part of his right ear. Blood splattered across the inside of the canvas. McKinney's eyes flew open to blinding pain and the dark silhouette of a man standing over him with a raised sword. He had less than a second to react. Maria was already bringing the blade down again. This strike would not miss. McKinney's hand found his rifle in the darkness. He did not aim. He did not think. 24 years of raw survival instinct took over. He swung the M1 like a club. The rifle but slammed under Maria's chin with enough force to shatter bone. The Japanese sergeant staggered backward. McKinney swung again. The second blow crushed Maria's skull. Outside the tent, McKinney could hear it. Footsteps. Dozens of them. Running through the camp. The main assault had begun. He was bleeding heavily from his ear. His head rang violently from the sword strike. And somewhere in the darkness, nearly 100 Japanese soldiers were moving in to kill everyone he knew. McKinney grabbed his rifle and stepped out of the tent. What he saw froze his blood. The machine gun position sat about 30 yards away. 3 Americans had been manning it when he went to sleep. Now there were muzzle flashes ripping through the darkness. Men were screaming. The sharp crack of Japanese Arisaka rifles mixed with the heavier boom of American M1 Garands. Japanese soldiers were flooding through the perimeter from the northeast in organized waves. The first wave had already reached the machine gun emplacement. McKinney could make out figures struggling in the darkness around the gun pit. His mind assessed the situation in seconds. The machine gun was the key to the entire defensive position. It dominated the main avenue of approach into the camp. If the Japanese captured it and turned it around, they could sweep the entire perimeter with fire. Every American in Company A would be slaughtered. McKinney ran straight toward the gun. The 2 soldiers who had replaced him at the position were fighting desperately. Private James Hendricks had taken a bayonet wound to the shoulder in the opening seconds of the attack. The third man saw Hendricks go down and made a split-second decision. He grabbed his wounded comrade and dragged him toward the rear of the perimeter. It was the right call. Hendricks would have bled to death if left behind. But it also meant the machine gun was now undefended. 10 Japanese infantrymen reached the emplacement before McKinney could. They swarmed over the sandbag wall. One immediately began trying to rotate the gun. The others formed a loose security ring, rifles pointed outward, watching for any American counterattack. McKinney did not slow down. He did not seek cover. He did not wait for help. He sprinted directly at 10 enemy soldiers who had just seized the most important weapon in the entire outpost. The Japanese saw him coming. A single American, bleeding from a head wound, charging straight at them through the pre-dawn darkness. 2 of them raised their rifles. McKinney was faster. He shot the first man at 15 yards. The M1's blast echoed across the camp. He shot the second man at 10 yards. By the time he reached the sandbag wall, he had fired 4 rounds. 4 Japanese soldiers lay dead. He leaped into the machine gun emplacement. The space inside measured roughly 8 feet by 6. 6 enemy soldiers were still alive in that cramped pit. Some were struggling to swing their rifles into position. Others were reaching for bayonets. One was still fumbling with the machine gun's traverse mechanism, trying desperately to bring it to bear. McKinney landed among them and kept firing at point-blank range. The M1 Garand carried 8 rounds in its internal magazine. He had already fired 4. He put the next 3 bullets into 3 Japanese soldiers at distances measured in inches rather than yards. 1 round remained. The 8th man stood directly in front of him, bayonet raised, lunging for McKinney's chest. McKinney fired his final round. The soldier collapsed instantly. The Garand's bolt locked back on an empty magazine with its unmistakable metallic ping. 3 Japanese soldiers were still alive inside the gun pit. They had heard that sound. They knew exactly what it meant. Before the empty clip had even finished ejecting, McKinney reversed his grip on the rifle and swung it like an axe. The walnut stock smashed into the first man's temple. He went down without a sound. McKinney swung again. The second soldier tried to block with his forearm. The rifle but shattered bone and continued straight into his skull. The third lunged forward with a bayonet. McKinney sidestepped and brought the rifle down across the back of the man's neck. The vertebrae cracked loudly. 10 Japanese soldiers had captured the machine gun. 30 seconds later, all 10 were dead. McKinney turned immediately to the weapon. His hands found the receiver. Something was wrong. During the fight, the gun had been damaged. The bolt was jammed. The feed tray bent out of alignment. He worked the charging handle twice. Nothing happened. The gun would not fire. The most important weapon on the perimeter was useless. McKinney lifted his head from the ruined machine gun. Dawn was beginning to wash the eastern horizon in pale gray light, and in that dim glow he could see them. More Japanese soldiers. Many more. They were regrouping at the jungle's edge, organizing for another assault. He had an M1 rifle with an empty magazine. He had just killed 10 men in hand-to-hand combat. His ear was still bleeding freely, and the main attack had barely begun. McKinney reached down and stripped a bandolier of ammunition from one of the dead Japanese soldiers. American .30 caliber rounds. The man had likely taken them during an earlier engagement. McKinney slammed a fresh clip into his rifle. Somewhere in the darkness, a Japanese officer was shouting commands. McKinney couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were coming again. He settled into the gun pit among the bodies, rested his rifle on the sandbags, and waited. The second wave emerged from the jungle about 60 yards out. McKinney counted at least 20 soldiers in the front line, with more behind them. They charged at a run, rifles leveled, bayonets fixed, screaming as they advanced. McKinney placed the front sight on the lead soldier and squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand was built for rapid semi-automatic fire. A trained infantryman could deliver 8 aimed shots in under 10 seconds. McKinney wasn't just a trained soldier. He was a hunter from Georgia who had been shooting his entire life. He was faster. The first Japanese soldier dropped at 60 yards. McKinney shifted his aim. The second fell. Then the third. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Hot brass flew to his right. He wasn't thinking. His body was operating on memory alone. Thousands of hours in the woods. Lead the target. Squeeze. Find the next one. Repeat. The clip ejected with a ping. McKinney slammed in another from the bandolier. The charging soldiers had closed 20 yards during the reload. 40 yards now. He opened fire again. The Japanese had expected to find a captured machine gun position. They had expected their comrades to be mowing down sleeping Americans. Instead, they ran headlong into a single man with a rifle, cutting them apart with relentless precision. 8 shots. Reload. 8 shots. Reload. Some attackers made it to within 15 yards before McKinney dropped them. Others tried to break left or right, searching for cover. He tracked them and fired. A moving target was easier to hit than a stationary one, something he had learned long ago while hunting deer. The second wave collapsed. Survivors fled back toward the jungle. McKinney counted the bodies scattered in front of him. 11 more. 21 total since the attack began. There was no time for relief. Japanese officers were already reorganizing their men. He could hear them shouting beyond the tree-line. Then he heard something else. A hollow, distant thump. A knee mortar. The first round exploded 10 yards to his left. Dirt and shrapnel sprayed into the gun pit. McKinney pressed himself flat against the sandbags. The second round landed closer. The third struck the parapet itself, burying him in debris. The Japanese had learned from the first 2 waves. They weren't going to charge blindly into his rifle fire again. They would soften the position with mortars first, kill him or at least force his head down, then send in the infantry. McKinney understood the problem instantly. If he stayed, the mortars would eventually get him. The gunners were adjusting their fire, walking it closer with every round. But if he abandoned the position, he would give up the only fortified point along this stretch of the perimeter. A grenade landed 3 feet from him. McKinney grabbed it and hurled it back over the sandbags. It detonated in midair. The blast slammed him sideways. His ears rang violently now. Blood from his shredded ear soaked through the crude bandage he had pressed against the wound. Another mortar round slammed into the sandbags. The wall partially collapsed, leaving him half exposed to the jungle. McKinney made his decision. Staying meant death. He grabbed 2 bandoliers of ammunition from the dead soldiers around him, slung them over his shoulder, and ran. The Japanese saw him moving. Rifle fire cracked from the tree-line. Bullets snapped past his head. McKinney sprinted 15 yards and dove into a shallow depression in the ground. Not a real foxhole, just a slight dip in the terrain. He threw himself down, rolled onto his back. Bullets punched into the dirt inches from his face. He crawled to the edge of the depression and found a firing position. The Japanese infantry was advancing again. They thought he was fleeing. They thought he was retreating. 2 squads emerged from the jungle at a fast walk, rifles ready, moving toward the abandoned machine gun pit. McKinney let them close to 30 yards. Then he opened fire. The attackers had bunched together while crossing the open ground. It was a mistake. McKinney's first shot dropped the point man. His second round struck the soldier directly behind him. The group scattered instantly, but there was no cover between the jungle and McKinney's new position. He picked them off as they ran. 8 shots. Reload. The survivors reached the machine gun pit and found only bodies, their comrades from the first wave. They had expected to find the American there. Instead, they discovered he was firing at them from a completely different angle. 3 more fell before they even managed to locate the flash of his rifle. McKinney shifted position again, moving 10 yards to his right while the Japanese tried to reorganize. He found another shallow depression and resumed firing from the new location. He was doing exactly what he had done his entire life in the Georgia woods. Never stay in one place, never allow your target to predict where the next shot will come from. A deer that hears 1 gunshot will freeze. A deer that hears 2 from different directions will panic and run in circles. The Japanese were running in circles now. Dawn was spreading across the sky. McKinney had been fighting for 18 minutes. His ammunition was running low. His ear was still bleeding steadily. And through the trees he could see movement that told him the enemy was massing for another major push. He needed more ammunition, and he knew where to get it. The Japanese dead around the machine gun pit carried supplies, not just the .30 caliber rounds he had already scavenged, but Arisaka rifles with full pouches and grenades clipped to belts. McKinney needed to get back there. He waited for a brief lull in the mortar fire, counted silently to 3, then sprinted across the open ground toward the gun pit. Rifle fire erupted from the tree-line. McKinney zigzagged as he ran. 1 bullet tugged at his sleeve. Another cracked past his head. He dove the final 5 feet and landed among the bodies he had created 20 minutes earlier. The smell hit him immediately: blood, cordite, and something else, the sharp copper scent of death. McKinney ignored it. He had butchered hogs on the farm, gutted deer in the Georgia heat. Death had a familiar smell. He moved fast, stripping bandoliers, scooping up loose clips, grabbing everything he could carry. He found 4 American ammunition pouches on Japanese soldiers who had likely taken them as trophies. 64 more rounds. He stuffed the clips into his pockets and belt. A Japanese soldier suddenly appeared over the sandbag wall, having crawled forward while McKinney was gathering ammunition. The man's rifle was already rising. McKinney shot him through the chest from 2 feet away. He took the dead man's grenades, 3 of them, Japanese Type 97 fragmentation grenades. He had never thrown one before, but he knew the process. Pull the pin. Strike the cap against something hard. Count to 4. Throw. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. More soldiers approaching from the left. McKinney armed a grenade, counted, and hurled it over the sandbags. The blast was followed by screaming. He armed the second grenade and threw it toward the tree-line where muzzle flashes clustered. More screams followed. He was already out of the pit before the third grenade left his hand, running again, changing position, never stopping. The sky was light enough now to see clearly. McKinney dropped into a shell crater 15 yards from his previous position. It was about 3 feet deep, enough to shield him from direct fire. From there he could see the entire approach from the jungle to the perimeter. Bodies littered the ground between the trees and his position. He counted quickly, 28, maybe 30. Some were still moving, wounded men crawling back toward cover. McKinney let them go. A wounded man tied up 2 healthy soldiers to carry him. Every casualty multiplied the enemy's problems. The mortar fire had stopped, and McKinney understood why. The Japanese had lost visual contact with him. Without observers, the mortar crews couldn't adjust fire on a target they couldn't see. He had maybe 15 or 20 minutes before they repositioned. He used the time to reload every empty clip he carried, his fingers working automatically. Press the rounds in. Feel the spring tension. 8 rounds per clip. He had scavenged enough ammunition for roughly 10 reloads, 80 rounds total. 80 rounds against however many Japanese soldiers remained in the jungle. The attack had lasted 23 minutes. McKinney had killed or wounded at least 30 men, but he knew the numbers were still against him. The Japanese had started with around 100 soldiers. Even if half were down, 50 remained, and he was still alone. Where was the rest of Company A? He didn't know. The Japanese assault had struck multiple points along the perimeter at the same time. His position was on the northeast flank, while other Americans were fighting their own desperate battles on the southern and western edges of the camp. The company commander was trying to organize a defense, but in the darkness and confusion of a night attack, coordination was nearly impossible. McKinney knew none of this. He only knew that no one had come to help him. No reinforcements. No supporting fire. Just him, his rifle, and the bodies accumulating in front of his position. The Japanese regrouped at the edge of the jungle. McKinney watched them through the trees, soldiers checking weapons, non-commissioned officers moving along the line, officers studying the American perimeter through binoculars. They had expected to overrun the outpost in 5 minutes. Instead, one man had killed nearly a third of their force in less than half an hour, and they still hadn't broken through. The officer lowered his binoculars and gestured toward a specific section of the camp. Not the machine gun pit. Not the craters where McKinney had been fighting. He was pointing toward the supply tents. A new approach, an attempt to bypass the killing ground McKinney had created. McKinney understood the intent instantly. They were going to swing around his flank and hit the camp from a direction he could not cover. From his current position, there was nothing he could do to stop them. He had a choice: stay in his crater with good cover and clear fields of fire, or move to intercept an attack he might not reach in time. McKinney climbed out of the crater and ran toward the supply tents. They were 40 yards away. He covered the distance in 8 seconds. He dove behind a stack of ammunition crates just as the first Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle along the southern approach. They hadn't expected him there. The lead element consisted of 12 soldiers moving in a tactical column. They were heading for the gap between 2 tents. Once through that opening, they would be inside the American perimeter with clear shots at soldiers fighting on other sections of the line. McKinney opened fire from behind the stacked crates. The first 3 men in the column dropped before the others could even react. The 4th and 5th tried to return fire, but they couldn't find him in the shadows between the tents. McKinney shot them both. The remaining 7 scattered. Some ran back toward the jungle. Others dove behind fallen logs and shallow depressions in the ground. McKinney tracked the ones who went to ground, pinning them in place, unable to advance and unable to retreat without exposing themselves. He shifted his aim toward the treeline, where more figures were appearing. The Japanese commander had committed his reserve to the flanking attack. 20 more soldiers, maybe 25. They saw their pinned comrades and hesitated at the edge of the jungle. That hesitation cost them. McKinney fired into the clustered group. 8 rounds. Reload. 8 rounds. Bodies fell among the trees. The survivors pulled back into deeper cover. 26 minutes into the attack, McKinney had now killed or wounded at least 35 enemy soldiers. The Japanese had tried 3 different methods: a frontal assault on the machine gun, a mortar bombardment followed by infantry, and a flanking attack toward the supply tents. All 3 had failed. The Japanese commander now faced a situation he had never encountered. Intelligence had indicated a lightly defended outpost with limited heavy weapons, a target meant to be crushed quickly by speed and numbers. Instead, everything had been disrupted by a force he could not identify. He did not know it was one man. His troops reported heavy fire from multiple positions. They had seen muzzle flashes from the gun pit, then from a depression 30 yards away, then from behind supply crates. It appeared the Americans had established overlapping fields of fire with multiple riflemen supporting each other. The conclusion was wrong, but it shaped what happened next. Mortar crews shifted their tubes to the southwest and began dropping rounds on the supply area. McKinney heard the impacts and moved immediately. He had learned that staying still attracted mortar fire, and movement meant survival. He ran north along the inside of the perimeter, found a foxhole abandoned when its occupant had gone to reinforce another sector, and dropped into it. This hole was deeper than his earlier positions, nearly 4 feet down, with a firing step that allowed him to see over the edge. The Japanese attacked again, this time from 2 directions at once, one group advancing from the south and another pushing in from the original northeastern approach. They were trying to split his attention, force him to choose. McKinney didn't choose. He fired 4 rounds at the southern group, dropping 2 men, then swung his rifle northeast and fired 4 more, dropping 2 there. The Garand pinged empty. He reloaded in under 3 seconds and fired again at the southern attackers. The assault stalled. Neither group could advance into the crushing rifle fire, but neither retreated. They went to ground and began returning fire. Bullets snapped overhead. Rounds thudded into the dirt around the foxhole. McKinney was now under fire from 2 directions. His ammunition was running low, and the Japanese were learning. They had realized the truth. The fire was coming from a single point. One rifleman, not a squad. Not overlapping positions. One man who moved fast and shot with lethal accuracy. That realization changed everything. The Japanese stopped charging in waves. They began advancing one at a time. One man moved while others provided covering fire. Then another advanced, leapfrogging forward, closing the distance yard by yard. It was a method designed to overwhelm a lone defender. Even the best marksman could not track multiple staggered movements from different angles forever. McKinney recognized the tactic immediately. He had seen it before in the wild. Coyotes hunted the same way, spreading out, approaching from multiple sides, forcing prey to focus on one threat while the others closed in. He was the prey now. 31 minutes had passed since the attack began. The Japanese were within 20 yards on the southern approach, 15 yards to the northeast. McKinney had fewer than 30 rounds left. The foxhole that had protected him was about to become his grave. He did not wait. McKinney exploded out of the hole and charged straight at the nearest group. 5 Japanese soldiers crouched behind a fallen palm tree 15 yards to the northeast, waiting for their comrades to close from the opposite side. They never expected their target to attack. McKinney shot the first man while still running. He shot the second as he reached the log. The third rose with a bayonet thrust. McKinney sidestepped and smashed the rifle but into the man's face. Bone crunched and the soldier collapsed. The fourth swung his rifle like a club. McKinney ducked under it and drove the steel but plate of his M1 into the man's throat. The fifth tried to flee. McKinney shot him in the back from 3 yards away. He kept moving. Stopping meant death. The southern group saw him leave the foxhole and sprinted toward him. McKinney turned and fired. 2 men dropped. He fired again. Another fell. The rifle pinged empty. 3 Japanese soldiers reached him before he could reload. One tackled him around the waist and slammed him to the ground. His rifle flew from his hands. Another stomped on his wounded ear, sending white-hot pain through his skull. The third raised his bayonet for the kill. McKinney grabbed the ankle of the man, crushing his head, and twisted hard. The soldier lost balance and fell. McKinney rolled, throwing off the man who had tackled him. The bayonet missed his chest by inches and buried itself in the dirt. McKinney scrambled to his knees, seized his rifle, and swung it in a wide arc that caught one attacker across the temple. The man collapsed. McKinney reversed the swing and drove the butt plate into another soldier's ribs, feeling bones break. The third man yanked his bayonet free and lunged. McKinney blocked the thrust with the rifle barrel. The blade slid along wood and steel, carving a groove into the stock. McKinney stepped inside the man's reach and smashed his forehead into the soldier's face. The man staggered. McKinney struck him twice more with the rifle, but until he stopped moving. 33 minutes into the attack, McKinney stood breathing hard, hands slick with blood, some of it his own. His ear was a shredded mass of torn flesh and dried gore. His uniform hung in tatters, ripped in a dozen places, his body bruised and cut in ways he didn't yet remember earning. But he was still alive. He looked out over the battlefield and saw bodies everywhere, Japanese soldiers who had come expecting to slaughter Americans and had instead run into something they never anticipated. There were more bodies than he could count in the gray light of early morning. Movement caught his eye to the right. 2 more soldiers were emerging cautiously from the jungle. McKinney raised his rifle and realized it was empty. He hadn't reloaded after the hand-to-hand fighting. The 2 Japanese soldiers saw him standing alone among the bodies of their fallen comrades and hesitated. McKinney charged. He covered 10 yards before they could react. The first soldier tried to raise his rifle but was too slow. McKinney's rifle but smashed under his chin. The second soldier turned and ran. McKinney caught him in 3 strides and clubbed him down from behind. 34 minutes. Then McKinney remembered the mortar position. He recalled seeing muzzle flashes from the southwest throughout the fight. Those knee mortars had been pounding his positions again and again. If he eliminated those crews, the indirect fire threat would be gone for good. He found a loaded rifle among the dead, an M1 with a full clip, dropped his damaged weapon, and started moving toward the mortar site. The mortar crews saw him coming, 2 men who had been adjusting their weapon for another fire mission. Now they scrambled to defend themselves. One reached for a rifle. The other tried to arm a grenade. McKinney shot them both from 45 yards. 35 minutes. He stood in the growing morning light, scanning the jungle for more movement. His chest heaved. His vision blurred from exhaustion and blood loss. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest. The jungle stayed quiet. No more soldiers emerged from the trees. No more mortar rounds fell. No more rifle fire cracked from hidden positions. There were only the moans of wounded men and the buzzing of flies already gathering on the dead. McKinney turned and walked back toward the American perimeter. He was halfway there when he saw figures approaching him. American uniforms. Soldiers from Company A who had finally fought their way through to his section of the line. They stopped when they saw him, covered in blood, carrying a rifle that wasn't his, standing amid a field of corpses. McKinney lowered his weapon. The reinforcements stared at the devastation around him, at the shattered machine gun position, at the bodies scattered from the jungle edge all the way to the perimeter. 36 minutes after Sergeant Ficaro Moria had slashed open his tent, Private John McKinney was still standing, still breathing, still in full control of the area. The fighting was over, but no one yet understood what had actually taken place. The soldiers who reached him that morning belonged to 2nd Platoon. They had been fighting on the western side of the perimeter when the Japanese attack began. It took them 36 minutes to push through to McKinney's position. What they found defied belief. Bodies were scattered across an area roughly 100 yards long and 60 yards wide. Japanese soldiers lay slumped over sandbags, crumpled inside shell craters, sprawled among supply crates, piled together near the destroyed machine gun emplacement. The platoon sergeant ordered a count. His men moved methodically through the area, checking bodies and marking positions. The count took 20 minutes. When they finished, the sergeant refused to believe the result and ordered them to count again. 38 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the immediate vicinity of the machine gun position. 2 more bodies were found near the mortar emplacement 45 yards away. 40 confirmed kills in a space that one man had defended for 36 minutes. The sergeant found McKinney sitting on an ammunition crate, pressing a blood-soaked bandage against what remained of his right ear. His uniform was shredded and stained. The stock of his rifle was cracked from repeated impacts against human skulls. He looked like a man who had walked through hell. The sergeant asked him what had happened. McKinney gave a short account. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. He spoke plainly, in brief sentences, without drama or exaggeration. The sergeant didn't believe him. No single soldier could kill 40 men in 36 minutes. It was impossible. There had to be other defenders, other riflemen supporting his position. The private was probably confused from blood loss and combat stress. But every other soldier in Company A had already been accounted for. The 2 men who had originally manned the machine gun with McKinney had been evacuated to the rear with wounds. Everyone else had been fighting on other sections of the perimeter. The physical evidence supported McKinney's story. Spent M1 casings littered the ground exactly where he said he had fought. The trajectories of the wounds on the Japanese bodies matched the firing angles from those positions. 1 man, 40 kills, 36 minutes. Company A's commander forwarded the report to battalion headquarters. Battalion passed it to regiment. Regiment sent it to division. At every level, officers read the account and assumed it was exaggerated. Combat reports often inflated enemy casualties. Soldiers under extreme stress made mistakes. The numbers had to be wrong. The 33rd Infantry Division dispatched an intelligence team to investigate. They interviewed McKinney, questioned witnesses, examined the battlefield, and counted the bodies again. Some accounts suggested the total number of Japanese dead exceeded 100, but only 40 could be conclusively attributed to McKinney's actions. The investigators reached a conclusion they could not escape. The report was accurate. Private John McKinney had single-handedly repelled an attack by roughly 100 Japanese soldiers. He had killed 40 of them. He had saved his company from near-certain destruction. A recommendation for the Medal of Honor was submitted in June 1945. The Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. Fewer than 3,500 have been awarded since the Civil War. The criteria are strict. The recipient must distinguish himself by conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty. By any reasonable standard, McKinney's actions met and exceeded those requirements. The recommendation moved through official channels. War Department reviewers examined the evidence and found exactly what the division investigators had found. The story was true. Every detail was supported by witness testimony and physical evidence. On January 23, 1946, Private John McKinney stood inside the White House as President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The official citation described his actions in formal military language, citing extreme gallantry, unmatched intrepidity, and single-handedly stopping an assault that threatened to annihilate his company. McKinney never gave speeches and never sought attention. When reporters asked him about the battle, he gave the same short answers he had given his sergeant that morning on Luzon. The tent, the sword, the machine gun, the waves of attackers. The press began calling him the Pacific's Audie Murphy. Murphy had earned his Medal of Honor by holding off German forces alone in France. McKinney had done something similar against Japanese troops in the Philippines. Both men faced overwhelming odds. Both refused to retreat. Both survived through skill, courage, and something harder to define. But while Murphy became a movie star after the war, McKinney went home to Georgia. He was 25 years old. He had a Medal of Honor, a third-grade education, and a partially severed ear that would never fully heal. The war was over. The killing had ended. Now John McKinney had to figure out how to live like a normal man again. He returned to rural Screven County, Georgia in 1946 and went back to the only life he had ever known: farming, hunting, fishing in the same creeks where he had learned to shoot as a boy. He almost never spoke about the war. Neighbors knew he had received the Medal of Honor and had seen the newspaper articles, but McKinney never mentioned it, never displayed the medal, never attended reunions or gave interviews. When asked about Luzon, he would say a few words and then change the subject. The nightmares were harder to hide. His family heard him in his sleep, waking suddenly, reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. The war followed him home in ways no medal could fix. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet a recognized condition. In 1946, soldiers were told to forget, move on, and be grateful they survived. McKinney did what most men of his generation did. He buried the memories and kept working. He married, raised a family, and worked various jobs around the county. Years passed. Korea came and went. Vietnam came and went. New wars produced new heroes and new veterans carrying their own quiet burdens. McKinney remained in Georgia, living quietly, aging quietly. The Medal of Honor sat unseen in a drawer. He had earned the nation's highest military decoration, and most of the people around him barely knew it. In 1965, writer Forrest Bryant Johnson began researching McKinney's story. Johnson was a veteran himself and understood what McKinney had lived through. He spent years tracking down witnesses, digging through military records, and reconstructing those 36 minutes on Luzon. The work was difficult. McKinney did not want to talk. Many witnesses were already dead. Records were scattered across multiple archives. But Johnson persisted because he believed the story mattered. His book, Phantom Warrior, was published in 2007, documenting McKinney's childhood in Georgia, his service in the Pacific, and the battle that earned him the Medal of Honor. The book finally brought national attention to a hero most Americans had never heard of. McKinney never saw it published. He died on April 5, 1997, in Sylvania, Georgia, at the age of 76. The sharecropper's son who had killed 40 enemy soldiers with a rifle and his bare hands passed away quietly, surrounded by family. He was buried in Screven County, not far from the land where he had learned to hunt. 20 years after his death, Georgia honored him again. In 2017, the state legislature voted to rename a section of highway in Screven County as the John R. McKinney Medal of Honor Highway. A ceremony was held. Veterans attended. The McKinney family accepted the honor on behalf of a man who had never asked for recognition. That highway sign still stands today. Drivers pass it without knowing the story behind the name. They do not know about the tent and the sword. They do not know about the machine gun and the 36 minutes. They do not know that the quiet farmer who once lived nearby saved an entire company through an act of violence and courage that still defies belief. 40 men in 36 minutes. One rifle. One soldier. One morning in the Philippines that should have ended in massacre, but didn't. Private John McKinney never tried to be a hero. He was a farm boy who joined the army because there was a war. He did what he had to do to survive and to protect the men sleeping around him. Then he went home and tried to live a normal life. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is John McKinney. If this story affected you the way it affected us, hit the like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We are pulling forgotten stories out of dusty archives every day. Stories about ordinary men who did extraordinary things. Real people. Real courage. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? This community spans the world. You're not just watching. You're helping keep these memories alive. Let us know you're here, and thank you for making sure John McKinney does not fade into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.